Hello and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Metro. My name is Elsa Bietta. I am your host. You're listening to KGNU Boulder, Denver, 88.5 FM, 1390 AM, and worldwide at kgnu.org. Today I have a joint interviewer here in the studio with me, Antonio Valenzuela. He's a westward backbeat writer, and he is a member of the National Honor Society of Psychology and the former editor of the CCD newspaper. Today, we're actually going to be talking to Peter Joseph, who is an independent filmmaker and social critic who is also a media activist and has produced and arranged multiple films as part of the Zeitgeist movement. Recently, Peter has released A Culture in Decline, what he calls the worst reality show of all time. So welcome, Peter.
Oh, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
And welcome, Antonio.
Thank you very much for making me your guest today.
So I want to actually start out with a clip of A Culture in Decline. This is from episode 2, Economics 101 by Peter Joseph.
If you were to take a poll today of our species, asking what truly are the most fundamental questions that pertain to human survival and prosperity, such as, what really supports human life, how food grows, what energy is, what creates and reinforces good public health, what defines a useful or detrimental belief system, you can rest assured that the vast majority would have more concrete answers about baseball statistics, fashion trends, sitcom plots, and religious scriptures. Not to demean the cultural pleasures and creativity of expression that creates enjoyment in this life, but we have a distortion of priority that has proven incredibly detrimental to the future of our sustainability on this planet, where the majority, facing clear mounting problems, not only doesn't understand what the root of such problems really are, they don't even know what questions to ask.
Questions upon questions. So we're actually going to start out here with the idea of questions, because what's going on here is you're posing very important questions about the fundamental function of our economy, world power, environmental sustainability, and accountability. Now, for me personally, I grew up in a family of artists and philosophers and was turned on to the likes of Alvin Toffler and Christopher Lasch and was always taught to question what was going on. And over the last decade, I've been involved in mind-body medicine and working in public health disparities around cultural education. And the veils, to me, have further faded and faded away, which has revealed that we're all part of a unified field of organization that allows for our mechanism to function and supersedes any kind of power and control system that we have in our government or our economy. So, Peter, going way back, tell me about the first time you can remember being called to think outside of the box or the social structure of American normalcy.
Good question. Well, I grew up like anybody else did in this self-indulgent kind of environment. I grew up as a musician, and I spent, thousands of hours over the course of my life and isolated into a practice room studying abstract music, mostly modern 20th century music. And I think that very foundation of being so outside of the box, with that symbolism of music, did something to my brain, basically, that forced me to be constantly outside of what would be considered normal or acceptable to a common culture. For example, tonal music, harmony, things like this that were so dominant in Western music for many centuries now became so challenged by experimentation, 12-tone serialism, and all sorts of other things. It kind of became a part of my culture to look at things that were outside of what everyone else found acceptable. So that's about as close as I could probably get. Ultimately, I've delved into works of like Buckminster Fuller and was a huge science and arts advocate. That was the core of my high school interests. And something happened along the way in my general pursuit where I realized that the social system itself, the social model itself that we have around us that is creating our psychology, creating our values, and, no pun intended, generating the zeitgeist that is amongst us, has very serious problems that people do not actually see. It's in front of their faces, but they're so groomed into it that they can't even recognize the problems, and that is, to me, the fundamental issue we have to overcome as a species at this time with all of the problems we have at hand.
So you've essentially sparked this desire within yourself to help educate the public, help provide information, and maybe produce some more critical thinkers. So the work that you've been doing, if people aren't familiar with it, they can look up Culture in Decline, or you can look at www.cultureindecline.org, or you can also just Google Peter's name and lots of stuff will come up. But basically, you're using new media. So you're actually working in somewhat of the framework that people's brains are already tolerating or digesting information, except for you're providing them with this intellectual stand base of new information and things that they might not think of. So I have a couple of questions for you around the concepts of isolation from media versus action, because we know that stress is biologically unsustainable and the amygdalas of our brains are physiologically capable of hijacking our brains to basically armor ourselves so we can't learn or grow from experiences or information. And most individuals are in this freeze state. Most people are sitting around unconscious. And when they take in this information that you're providing, a lot of people feel violated, they feel angry, they feel fearful, or they feel crippled. So what are some different things that you feel that people can do to take this information and then not internalize it, but create movement or create change?
Right. Well, I have to mention, of course, the Zeitgeist film series, which is where I began before Culture in Decline. And I'm also the founder of a global sustainability advocacy group called the Zeitgeist Movement. And with all of my media work, coupled with what came to be an enormous amount of activism work over the past 5 years, for those that are familiar, they can go to thezeitgeistmovement.com and find out about all the things that we do and have been doing. I try to take as many different strategies as humanly possible, to be perfectly frank. So you have the traditional activist approach that tries to create some patches to the current system, fundraising, poverty work, things like that. And then we have more extravagant types of approaches that really try to make an intellectual movement to get people to see the failures of the system for what they really are, its causality. I do plenty of, very straightforward essay-type work for providing what you consider to be academic-style references for all of the things that I've talked about with respect to public health, structural violence, and all the things inherent to the system. But Culture in Decline is the unique one in my new experiment, because if you've watched this show, it's a satire. It's a bad public access show that is a satire of itself, where I'm gauging those that are of the more, say, George Carlin ethic, those that have been so kind of alienated by the system that they prefer to make fun of it and try to be above it, but yet they're still stuck in it, and they might not be motivated for change, per se. But I think the biggest audience out there are the ones that, the most powerful audience out there for change are the ones that are so exhausted by the system that they can't bring themselves to feel like they can contribute. They're struggling so much to get by, and they're ultimately just mad. They're just angry, and there's a lot of anger out there that I've come to find in my general dealings. And what I'm trying to do is create a catharsis with this series and build on and give hope to those that have become so cynical that they really just don't want to push forward at all, and sadly, some of which would rather see the system collapse entirely than to help it at all. Such as the elections that came up, I've had endless debate with people that just did not want to vote, and I'm trying to explain to them that while voting has very little relevance in its broad scheme, if you look at what political economy means and where it came from, it's still, we need to try and work with what we have as we attempt to literally overcome it all through larger order revolution and change and activism.
So you're really actually trying to harness that power of the collective anger so that people can get angry enough to change something. Because we know in the natural rules or in the natural laws of the world that anger is actually, in its natural expression, supposed to create movement. It is what is the catalyst for action. And most people are pathologically affected by anger, where it then becomes implosive or it becomes resentful, and that affects them. So they feel trapped, and then they feel fearful. And if we go back to what fear is really about our ability to survive as a species. It's actually the driving force that keeps us reproducing and moving forward. And when it's expressed in its pathological state, it becomes crippling. So a lot of people are in these pathological emotional states, and they're consuming all of this information. And so what you're saying is this is hopefully, getting into their conscious level and then helping them to redefine it by, changing those emotions into more action?
Absolutely. I think that the great arsenal of minds out there are the ones that are very, very smart and aware, but they're shut down by this system. And some of the greatest minds I've ever met are the ones with the worst self-esteem, because this system doesn't allow that type of fruition to occur with those that are truly sensitive enough to see the problems and to see where the action could arise. And it's very daunting, to be perfectly frank with you. When you look at the activist community, and I don't mean to put down activism across the board in the sense of, say, Greenpeace or all the environmental or human rights activist groups, but there's a problem here that's existing where they work within the system, and they don't actually think outside of the box enough to notice that we have to make some broader structural changes for the true angles that these institutions are going for to come forward. And I think there's a mind lock, if you will. And the entire point of my work ultimately is to break that mind lock. Even if people don't like me or they don't like the points being made, because I am deliberately provocative because I want to get under people's skin. I want them to say, I don't like this guy. I want to disagree with him. I want to find a bunch of information that will prove he's wrong. And I think, as weird as that may sound, I think it actually works.
So we're really talking about sparking free thinkers and helping people to feel like that it is okay and normal to be a free thinker. As I introduced earlier in the radio show, I am joined here by Antonio Valenzuela. He is a backbeat writer here locally and is a National Honor Society of Psychology. So just kind of talking about that brain frame, I think Antonio has a question.
Yeah,
sure.
Absolutely. And thanks a lot for your time, Peter. We really appreciate it. I think that one thing that you just brought up, that dialogue must be, we must participate in dialogue for us to actually reach this next level of consciousness and to understand some of the things that are going on. And one of the things I think that most people have had a bit of a problem with as far as digesting the Zeitgeist thing, especially in the addendum, is the idea that free enterprise and economics is not really a free system. And I think a lot of people have had trouble coming to grips with that because it's something that's embedded in their everyday life, dealing with money and looking at that. And I think that your new series, The Culture in Decline, I think also really touches on the economic aspect that people are lacking and their lack of understanding. So if you could go further in depth to that and describe what you meant with the free enterprise in the addendum movie, and then how The Culture in Decline is expanding on that notion.
Sure. Well, I'd also point out that the third of the trilogy for Zeitgeist Moving Forward was probably the definitive treatment on the socioeconomic system and specifically the market economy that you denote. And I will point out on the broad scale that my core interest when it comes to what is generating social pathology, I like to call it, is the socioeconomic system, because it's completely decoupled from the natural orders of the world. It's decoupled from what really would produce good public health and happiness. We're lost in materialistic understandings due to the growth economy. But not to go too far, at the very core, I think, of my activism in its entirety is the recognition that the political economy, which is a term not used that often, which is really the economy because politics is an outgrowth of our economic system, something that's also long lost, is at the core the vast majority of the ecological and public health issues and conflicts, which I consider part of a public health issue, across the world and in all societies today. The free market system is not free. It's very rigid in its psychology in the way that you can have the freedom, as I would say, to take away the freedom of others. And this has been touted with propaganda for so long now. And we've had this duality emerge that anything that has to do with, quote, socialism, which is also a very empty term these days given how it's used, is a bad thing, that people aren't supposed to work together, that the state, or whatever you want to refer to it as, should have no obligation. In fact, it's a bad thing for them to have an obligation to try and actually take care of the society to which created it. And these notions really have only served the upper 1%. I mean, if I was a propagandist for a system where I wanted to keep a feudalistic type of structure, I would want nothing more than the general population to believe that their freedom is inherent to an economic system where the exchange of money is completely open, and therefore those with the most money, which is very easy to get if you work in the upper echelons of this system through the banking system, for example, on Wall Street, and hence the entire political structure, that this idea that freedom for money is going to be the only thing that will save them, and that this 1% can do everything it wants because they're given the mandate to do so, because if the system wasn't based on that psychology, people wouldn't tolerate it. So every time someone comes forward and tries to criticize the 1%, which is getting larger and larger, creating all sorts of problems with the stratification in public health, which is another huge subject I could go into, everyone shuts it down immediately today to think that, well, the alternative is much worse. And that's just not true. So, not to get too too tangent-oriented here. I just want to reiterate that in a true society that sees a scientific referent, that sees the fact that public health is fixed, that human needs are fixed, if you don't give people the food and nutrition they need along with the psychological support they need in development, they produce neuroses and they create all sorts of problems physiologically and psychologically that hurt everyone over the course of time. So my big argument to conclude this point is that we have to create a level where the society recognizes the scientific causality of the human organism, not to mention the ecological causality of the world around us, so we don't pollute, so we don't exploit, so we don't overrun resources, which we continue to do for the necessity for constant growth and profit, and create a model that respects this first and foremost. And until we do that, a lot of the problems that we're going to see can only get worse. And sadly, this neuroses, this public health problem, this social pathology that's come forward is so rampant, worse than any time, I believe, in human history, because everyone is completely backwards with respect to what they value.
Well, and I think that that's a really important point, that if we are backwards in respect to what we value, we normalize these behaviors. This has been something that's been really up for me lately as a public health activist, as somebody who's actually providing education and direct clinical services for the general public. The level at which people understand their bodies, the level at which people understand what diseases, what health disparities are, is completely irrelevant to them. They see no connection between what they consume in the media, what they hear, what they see. Right. And really what has happened is it's called, what I like to say is normative abuse. So all of the things like racism, sexism, sexual violence, molestation, substance abuse, HIV, diabetes, heart disease, all of these things are actually results of normative abuse patterns that we, one, play out with our individual selves and screw our immune systems up. Two, we play them out with our relationships. And three, our relationships is what builds the community. And then you have society. So really it's about rethinking and redefining and completely, it's almost like each individual has to be responsible for reawakening themselves to change that mechanism in their own brain. And unfortunately, our brains have been taken over, in a sense. And what I've been calling it is spiritual warfare, because people's brains aren't even at the capacity where they can critically think or where they can access their higher senses of self, so they can actually stand over and look and see that they are actually being pulled through a system of power and control.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The only thing I would add to that is there's a chicken and egg type of thing where do we create our system or has the system created us? And obviously there's no answer to that really. But in the long term, I was born into this society. I was handed very specific values about the necessity for competition, the necessity to disregard the 1 to 3 billion people starving on this planet. I was handed this system that has values that are set. And I think that's something that is an equal gravity when we think about where we came from and the causality mainly of our psychology and hence sociology. And that's why I think it's really important that people focus on the largest possible overhead relationship of causality, which to me is the social structure. We can do lots of personal things, right? We can revolutionize our mind. We can go against the grain. We can realize the falsity of it, and we hope that so-called collective consciousness will take hold. But until this larger order thing happens, which of course is a part of that, it's still going to produce the same type of psychological problems that have happened generation after generation. So I just want to make sure people think about it that way.
Well, yeah, and I think that that's really important because our new science, our new quantum physics is telling us that the actual only causal agent is consciousness and the field of consciousness. So if the field of consciousness is what is creating all of this, then how do we change the consciousness? Do you know?
Yes. Yep. Absolutely.
One of the things,
that's where it comes down. I'm sorry, go on.
One of the things I definitely want to ask you before we end this today is you mentioned the activism and some of the activist groups that have been out there. How have we seen the mainstream media and the government and the plutocracy really take over some of those activist groups? Because I feel like even though we talked about voting and how that's important, I feel like much of the hope is going to be lost when people see that it's the same banking cartel that's, controlling both parties. Because today people woke up very happy that Obama got elected. How do we see those activist groups as we're mobilizing people with information like that you have and other people like the Venus Project have and things like that? How do we turn that activism into real effective activism and not let it get co-opted by those who wish to distract from the points that those activists have.
Yeah, I'd say there's two types of co-opting that's occurring. There's the direct co-opting, which is the compromised circumstances that happen on a per-case basis with private organizations that come in, they give funding, or they begin to get to know certain individuals in certain communities, and they start to gain influence within that community. This stuff has been going on forever. Martin Luther King's photographer, for example, worked for the CIA. Not many people know that. He worked for Martin Luther King for years, yet he was infiltrated. So these things have been there for a long time, and they've been part of the rhetoric of the establishment forever, at least in this modern form. So, but the real issue to me is the co-opting on the larger psychological scale, and that's really what my point is that everyone is still in the box a little bit too much. When we go to, say, Greenpeace, you look at all their great activism and what they're trying to do to stop all of these profit-related issues, very rarely does someone step back and say, you know what, maybe it's the institution of the market economy, its competitive basis, that is driving all these, say, pirate fishermen to do what they do in order to probably feed their families. Same with the Mexican drug cartels. We see this huge epidemic down there, and the police and everybody, the DEA, are all trying to get their hands around this serious, deadly problem. But yet no one stops to think maybe it's the restrictions of the market and monetary economy inherently that are generating this very sick distortion that's causing people to behave in these ways. And across the board, the ACLU, even great media outlets like Democracy Now! And all of these great people that are doing good stuff, they stop right at that point. You'll notice they do not address. They talk about corruption as though corruption is an anomaly in the system when it's actually the de facto circumstance. Everything is generated by a path of corruption. The entire system is a corruption of the natural world. If you look at a hard drive, it corrupts. It means it's not operating correctly in the context that it's supposed to exist in. Our entire socioeconomic system, call it capitalism, call it whatever, is a massive corruption that works against the natural laws, basically, of the universe and human sustainability. And until that's realized, it's just kind of aloof to me. That's my driving point. So those are the two levels of co-op, and the latter one is most critical to me, and that comes back really to awareness. So all the activist institutions need to wake up and begin to see the true causal link here, and then we can actually have real progress.
So when you talk about the actual laws of the universe, I know you had mentioned Buckmaster Fuller, that tensegrity model, that everything has a mutual symbiotic relationship and supports the whole. So really, a lot of the solutions that we can see to these problems are around the concept of sustainability. We know that the best healing, the best medicine, it works by building relationships in the body that are already working. So the organism of the body or the system has the resources it needs to heal and balance itself. Same thing with the reflection of how our earth works and how our social structures work. So I have one question for you, because doing some research and being a follower of what you've been doing, we were able to see that you had partnered with the Venus Project in the past, and those collaborative relationships around sustainability and the models of resource-based economy seem to be so aligned with what you're saying. Can you tell me a little bit about why that relationship has been disassociated, or why you two are no longer working together?
Well, it's an unfortunate circumstance, and it has nothing to do with the ideology behind the sustainability work at all. It has to do with problems that naturally arise out of the system, once again, namely money and ego problems. Going into any specific detail, the relationship ended because of internal conflicts that had to do with fundraising on the part of the Venus Project, along with some very broad claims that, unfortunately, I attribute to a bad psychological place of the two people that run the Venus Project. And I'll leave it at that. The Zeitgeist movement doesn't claim ownership as any ideas. It simply wants to get relevant information out there. And unfortunately, it was the Venus Project's decision to go their more independent think tank route. And at that stage, there was nothing I could do. It wasn't my preference to do so. I prefer to get as much unity as possible and to keep as many organizations working towards the common goal as we can. So that's an internal problem, typical of human character at this stage, and that's about all I can really say about it. But it's important to understand this understanding of causality with respect to what true sustainability is, what really defines public health, human happiness, ecological balance. These are scientific principles, and I can't reiterate that word enough.
I think that is one of the most... They're not ideological at all, and that is one of the most fundamental things that I think I found interest in your work, is that you have taken a chance to actually say that, people don't people don't understand the laws of nature because they live so far away from nature. People don't understand quantum physics. People don't have this information. So it's out there, and we understand that this is the only superseding law that will ever control or govern us as a planet or as a species. So anything that is a division of power and control really is going against it and is going to have side effects. That's where we get sick. That's where disease happens in any organism. So what it sounds like right now is our Earth is in this huge healing process, and the people that are on the groundwork doing this amazing stuff, like Culture in Decline, like the Venus Project, really need to continue to do their work, and we all need to intend and allow that there is a healing and bridges are gapped, and that those social constructs of ego, distortion, money, power, violence can begin to fade away, because it's keeping people from doing the good work that they're doing, but it's still going to go on, and we're still going to heal these patterns by creating new patterns. You've been listening to KGNU Boulder, Denver. We're at 88.5 FM, 1390 AM, and worldwide on kgnu.org. We're talking today with Peter Joseph, the creator of Culture in Decline. I'm going to wrap it up with a Pheromone track that we spent time getting ready for the radio. Thank you, Peter, so much for being on the show today. All of our listeners out there, check Peter Joseph out, check out Culture in Decline, and check out his work.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.